No chance. That's what you got. Oh my God, guys. What's going on? We are here finally. Happy Friday to you and welcome to your Mr. McMahon Netflix 6-part docuseries full breakdown and review. This dropped on Wednesday, this past Wednesday, the 25th. And I had decided earlier on in the week that Friday would be the day that we would be up here to talk about all of this. And this was a long documentary, 6 parts long. I've got a ton of notes. And I got to say, before we even get going here, that I think the majority of the feedback so far on the documentary has been largely a disappointment. A lot of people felt like they didn't understand what the point of this was. It was basically just a retelling of Vince McMahon's story that pretty much coincides with the story of WWE. It was just a chronicling and a retelling of their history and Vince's story alongside that. And for us fans, those of us that are crazy fans, that we follow the ins and outs of everything and know every little detail and minutia of the story of WWE, to us, this might not be very revealing. Now, granted, there were a few bombshells in here and some things we didn't know throughout the course of these 6 parts, but nothing that was really that earth-shattering. And some of these stories, lacked corroboration from people, in the know that could help, back up some of these claims and whatnot, things like that. And of course, the last episode is what really focused heavily on the hush money scandal, the Janelle Grant lawsuit, and all of the really, really nasty stuff kind of near the end of Vince McMahon's story and career. But as we know, this was in production prior to Vince McMahon stepping down back in 2022 when the initial hush money report came out, and then that was followed by several more. And then after Vince forced his way back in, the lawsuit dropped and he was out. So all of these interviews, the production of this documentary was all taking place prior to any of this shit hitting the fan. And one of the things they mentioned in the very beginning was that, that breaking news, that story kind of halted production, and it kind of sat tabled here for a couple of years until they figured out, how to proceed, how to move forward. And they ended up finishing and concluding this documentary, even though Vince's story isn't really finished being told yet because he is currently in a world of shit. But as we heard prior to the documentary being released earlier on in the week, apparently Vince McMahon had attempted to buy back the documentary just so he could kill it. He knew this was going to make him look bad. And we'll talk about what Bruce said in the final episode about being a gotcha piece and whatnot. And Vince wanted to buy the story back so he could kill it and bury it. And they told him to go F himself. And this is the very same network that Monday Night Raw is about to start airing on in January of 2025. First episode might actually be here in LA, by the way. So I might be at that. But overall, I do understand the feedback of, well, we didn't really learn anything, but at the same time, I don't know if this documentary was really meant for me and you. We all know Vince's story inside and out, some of us even more than others, but this documentary, I think, was being produced and presented to people who don't know everything about Vince's life and just an overall retelling of the WWE story, which it is a tremendous story, and so is Vince McMahon. So if you're somebody that's only kind of been somewhat familiar with wrestling, or you're curious about wrestling, or you knew who Vince McMahon was but didn't know anything else about him. This is the same producer that did the Tiger King and all that stuff. So if you like that type of stuff, hearing about somebody's life that you otherwise wouldn't even know or care about, this is something that can tell this story, I guess, accurately to an outside audience outside of the 2% of wrestling fans that know every single detail about everything. So in the context of that, I'm looking at it as, okay, the documentary might be a disappointment to us, but if you are somebody that is more of a casual fan or doesn't know Vince's story, you might have found this pretty enjoyable and also pretty disgusting. And I really don't know what to make of all of it. We're going to talk about a lot of stuff here, and a lot of stuff that they get into are things that we have discussed in detail on this podcast for many years. So when I was thinking about doing this review and how I was going to structure it, I'm like, you know what? I want to come up and do a full review. I want to talk about each and every episode because we all know what Vince McMahon has been accused of. We've unpacked that a lot, and there's a lot still to happen. That lawsuit is currently paused, but it's going to be picked back up. Vince is going to have to answer for that. He's going to have to, answer for, the federal search warrant. All that stuff that's still going on with him is probably, I think it already has, but Vince McMahon has already disgraced his legacy. And he's not somebody that in the future I'm going to want to talk about very much. I'm not going to want to do a big, podcast on Vince McMahon's life and career when there's so much ugliness attached to him. So I thought this might be a really good way to kind of put, kind of a lid on Vince McMahon's life and career, his entire body of work. I don't know when we're ever going to sit down and talk about this again on this channel. So this documentary, even though it went through a lot of stuff we already know, might be a good chance for me to lay down some opinions and thoughts on Vince's life and his career and the story of the WWE, since I don't know when the next time we're going to sit down and unpack all of this, because I think the more time goes on, the uglier and more disgraced Vince McMahon's legacy is going to get. And it's just going to, quite frankly, feel gross to come up here and talk about him, especially if he's rotting in jail or something like that. So, Vince's story, the final chapter has not been written, but his WWE chapter pretty much has. He has a lot left to deal with in his personal life. He's pushing 80 years old. He's going to have a rough ending, but in terms of his life in professional wrestling, in WWE, pulling strings, having power, having control, those days are over. And we're going to get into all of it here. So please, as we go through here, let me know your thoughts and opinions on the documentary. I'm sure a lot of you are going to consider it a disappointment, and I don't disagree with that take at all. But you got to understand, this is a Netflix documentary. This is not a WWE produced documentary that they're pushing out to their fan base. This is a Netflix documentary for the general public. So for those people, I thought this did a pretty good job of detailing the history of WWE. And a lot of times when you were watching this documentary, it didn't really feel like a Vince documentary. It felt more like a WWE documentary. But the two really do go hand in hand. Every big decision, every big moment in WWE, Vince McMahon was behind that. Every big moment and every big failure, Vince McMahon was behind it. So that was an opinion that I saw a lot on social media. It feels like I'm just watching a WWE documentary. Well, of course you are. Vince McMahon's entire life is WWE. Vince McMahon's life and WWE are intertwined, which is why it's got to be pretty hard for him sitting on his ass at home right now doing nothing and powerless, for the first time in his life. So this was crazy. It was crazy. We're going to get into a lot of stuff here and kind of unpack it one episode at a time. I will say hello to everybody here in the chat in 1 second. I'm not going to do tons of shout outs today. If you notice, I didn't even do a countdown screen. We just came right up here because we only have 2 hours to unpack this, and I want to allow ourselves enough time to do everything. So I'm going to say hello to everybody real quick, and then what we'll do, we'll pause in between each episode, and that's when I'll hit any super chats that are in here, things like that, and anything else that you guys might have to say in the chat. We will be here tomorrow for a podcast, so I know there's wrestling news going on. There's some big Lucha Brothers news today. Shane McMahon was photographed with Young Bucks yesterday, and a few other news tidbits happening. Plus, we have SmackDown coming up in about 2 hours, so we'll be here tomorrow, probably pretty early, probably same time that we're up right now, to kind of discuss all of that. And then unfortunately, we will not be here on Sunday for our classic watch along. I apologize for that, but we'll be back up here Monday for Raw. So keep all that in mind for the weekend. It's very good to see all the channel members here. Jimmy Anderson, welcome to the family, my friend, and it's always good to see you in here, and thank you for that very generous drop from Sweden. I hope and think this Vince last 15 minutes of fame, then I hope he and Linda go and live the rest of their life in anonymity. I don't even think Vince and Linda are together. It was crazy to see Linda on the documentary as well. But Jimmy, I don't think we're going to have to worry about Vince and Linda being a big part of our lives anymore. If they turn up once or twice in an interview, maybe, but I'm not really concerned about them really being in our way, if that helps. Want to say hello to Jet the Hawk, Zane G. I'm going to hit the channel members. Garrett Osborne, Colin Wright, Big J, Danny in Oak Park. Always happy to see you. We got Mike Games version 1. Right on. JJ Leg, Isaac. We got Garrett, the Juliet, Michael Kumo is in here as well. Denny Down Bad, and Zane G chiming in with the 5. Thank you for that, man. If this thing was on the dark side, would it have been the same shit, overblown out of proportion or glossed over? You mean like if this story would have been a Dark Side of the Ring episode? I don't know if they would have done a 6-part dark side of the ring on Vince. If it was dark side, I don't know if they would have focused so much on Vince's, accomplishments, probably more his failures and his extremely gross behavior. So I think dark side, it's in the name. It's dark side of the ring. So they're going to focus on Vince's dark side is what I would imagine. So I think it would probably be even more negative than the Netflix documentary was. Mike Witt is also here. Shell Shock, Ryan Adams, Rodrigo, David Brown, Daniel Barry Sports, John Woodmass, awesome, Ben Espinoza. Good to see you, man. All y'all. I know I'm missing a few. Rob Strickland, Harry Rice. Thanks again, everyone, for being here this afternoon. We got to get into this. Now, in terms of the documentary, we had a lot of talking heads. And you would imagine with Vince McMahon's story being told that you're going to have a lot of people that Vince helped make a lot of money being on this. And pretty much every top star that he had was interviewed for this thing. We had Vince McMahon himself. We had Shane McMahon. We had Stephanie McMahon. We had Linda McMahon. We had Hulk Hogan, John Cena, Stone Cold Steve Austin, Bret Hart, Triple H, The Undertaker, all those big stars. Some of Vince's top guys all interviewed for this thing. We also had Bruce Pritchard, of course. Tony Atlas, shout out to Tony Atlas in the sleeveless shirt, button-down shirt with a tie. Wow, that's a choice. I also had Brian Gewirtz was also interviewed for this thing, along with Kay Koplovitz, who was the founder of the USA Network, and Bonnie Hammer, who was the VP of original programming from 1989 to 1998. And I remember back in the Monday Night Wars reading articles and magazines about this lady named Bonnie, who Vince was, kind of collaborating with, trying to figure out what they can do to make Raw better. And I remember reading, like, the two of them sat down and watched an episode of Nitro together. It was just wild stuff. And I'm like, oh, that's Bonnie. I've heard her name before. We also had Dave Meltzer, another one that was interviewed, and their in-house historian, David Shoemaker, who sometimes does not know what the fuck he's talking about. But overall here, it wasn't too bad. Nothing that he was saying was really irritating me. I think he's annoyed me in other documentaries a little bit more when he's gotten some of his facts wrong. But those are the primary faces and talking heads that you'll see throughout this documentary. Now, episode 1 was entitled Junior, and this pretty much starts off right from the beginning with Vince's life. But before we do that, they let us know right in the opening, as Vince was sitting there in a series of texts on the screen, that before the final interview took place with Vince McMahon, breaking news halted production. And then they then go into what they learned back in 2022 with the WWE board receiving an anonymous email about hush money and cover-ups, and that was likely only the tip of the iceberg. Then came the Wall Street Journal report reporting the hush money scandal in June of 2022. That triggered a series of events that uncovered even more non-disclosure agreements, government investigations, and Vince McMahon then would step down. He would then come back, and then, of course, it all culminating with him selling the company, and then the lawsuit hitting. And that's when the shit really hit the fan. One day after Janelle Grant filed that lawsuit, Vince McMahon officially resigned once and for all from WWE, and he was pretty much pushed out. Now, the documentary lets you know right up front, and I'm glad that they do this, because it's tough to watch some of these guys talk about Vince in the way that they do, and then we learn the things that we learned about him. And it said that the majority of the interviews for this documentary were filmed before the sexual misconduct allegations were made public. And that's very, very important. If I'm Triple H, and I'm on this thing saying really, really great things about this man, that's, it's like, ugh, that did not age well at all. So at least they let you know that all of this niceness and all of these things that people are saying about Vince McMahon were all filmed before the allegations really dropped. So once they kind of inform us of that, it's time to get into more of like a lineal chronicling of Vince McMahon's life. And Vince McMahon, right off the bat, says something to the effect of, "Oh, I wish I could tell you what the real stories are. Holy shit." And they're like, "What, you're not going to tell us everything?" He goes, "No, I can't tell you everything. I don't really want people to know the real me." So right off the bat, just red flags. Of like, if people only knew. Like, think about the stories that we do know about Vince and how fucked up they are. And Vince here is openly admitting, oh, if you only knew the half of it, if I told you some of these real stories, if I told you some of the things that are and memories that are ricocheting around inside of my head, you would pass out. I mean, that's almost like what he is implying here, because the stories that we already know about Vince are so unbelievably fucked up. And when he's sitting there telling you right off the bat that I'm not going to tell you anything, I'm just going to give you a little. He goes, I'm going to give you enough to satisfy you. So he's not even willing to really be that honest. He's even upfront letting you know right off the bat, episode 1, before we even get rolling here, that he's going to tell you what he wants you to know. And that's it. So that's alarming. Now, in the first episode, they would touch on this in a later episode, but in the first episode, they talked very little about his childhood and about growing up. We've heard more about Vince's growing up in WWE documentaries and other pieces that have been done on Vince. Like the military school stuff and, getting in a lot of fights and just kind of being a troubled youth and whatnot. And we do know that he did live, in a trailer park with his mother in North Carolina where really, really effed up things took place. And he got into a little bit of that. He mentioned growing up in a trailer park with his mother and an abusive stepdad. And Vince talks about not knowing that his name was even McMahon until he met Vince Sr. at age 12. And he's talked about that before, but he's really never talked about why, or how he got into Vince Sr.'s life. But they did talk a lot about, the tension between Vince McMahon and his dad. And apparently, Vince Sr., really struggled to show his son, emotion. They never even spoke. Vince said that they never even spoke about why Vince wasn't in his life up until age 12. They just never talked about it. Vince went his entire life without his father ever saying, I love you to him. These are all things that, really obviously really affected Vince McMahon. And we would see that carry over with Shane McMahon. And you would really feel for Shane McMahon in this documentary, big time, and how Vince McMahon kind of, mirrored a lot of what his dad did with him, being real tough on him, and tough to, emotionally connect to and whatnot. And they just had a really, really strange relationship. And I think that's part of the reason why Vince had a strange relationship with Shane. I think if Shane would have been a girl, if Vince would have had 2 daughters, it might have been a little bit different, because I think Stephanie had it easier than Shane. But Shane, kind of caught a lot of that, leftover tension from Vince and his dad. And that was, pretty apparent throughout the course of this thing. So they talk about, the same story we've heard before. They talk about how Vince McMahon kind of got the job, the announcer gig. There was a couple of situations. There was one with, I think, Ray Morgan, who had gotten like a DUI or something, got Vince on the microphone once. And then another one of his announcers wanted more money. Might have been the same guy. Might have been Morgan. I don't remember. Wanted more money from Vince Sr. Vince opted not to pay him and gave Vince the announcing job instead. So fast forward a couple of years, Vince Sr. is planning to sell the company, or starting to look into selling the company. And I don't know if I ever really knew that Gorilla Monsoon was the heir apparent, that most people thought that Vince McMahon was going to sell the company to Gorilla Monsoon. Now, I know Gorilla Monsoon was a big part of the company, and Gorilla's employment was a part of the deal with Vince buying from his dad. But I'm not even sure if I really truly knew. I've heard of Gorilla Monsoon's name coming up before. I know he was a big deal. But in terms of him being the one to purchase the company, that's interesting. I mean, I'm glad it didn't go that way. I'm the biggest Gorilla Monsoon fan in the world. I was actually in the building for, his last appearance in WWE. And I love him with all my heart. He's a fucking legend. But I'm not sure where the business would be if it would have been sold to Gorilla Monsoon, because he would have kept it in the territories. He would have stayed right there. He would have continued on the tradition as it was going, and wrestling probably would not have evolved, or taken a lot longer to evolve. And WWE, might not have survived had that been the case. But Vince McMahon Jr. put together a deal that he submitted to his father, and he's told this story before as well, where he would purchase the company and he would make, like 4 big or 3 big balloon payments. And if he missed any of these payments, the company then defaults back to the original owners and they keep the money. And because of this deal, Vince Sr. thought it was pretty good and agreed to it. And Vince McMahon was able to succeed in that purchase, and he made all the payments, and he officially became the full-blown owner of WWE. And once he did that, then it was on. Then Vince starts going national. He sees the vision. Cable TV is implemented, and no longer is wrestling going to be a territorial, syndicated system anymore. Vince McMahon is going to go national, and they talked about how Vince McMahon basically just raided, the talent, especially I think the biggest victim of WWE was the AWA, because that's where Hulk Hogan was. That's where Mean Gene was, Jesse the Body Ventura. So many wrestlers were in the AWA and all made the jump. And so, what they chronicled was, what Vince did. Vince moving into these territories, offering the talent more money. They would then sign with them. WWE would go around all the territories, taking up all the top talent that those territories created, and then run their towns with those talents. And that's what happened to the AWA a lot. WWE would sign all their talent and then run Minneapolis or run Denver or run another prominent AWA town with more AWA talent than what AWA had. And he did that to everybody. And he just swept through the company, just tornado Vince, just ripping a hole through the fabric of the territory system in pro wrestling. But he had every right to do that. It was free enterprise. You can go in, offer whatever, and people can choose to jump. It's not like the wrestlers were offended by this. The wrestlers saw the money. They jumped on the bandwagon. So it's not like the wrestler, some wrestlers had loyalty to their territories, some did, but the majority of them took the money and ran, and you can't really blame them at the time. So once Vince starts doing that, starts taking up a lot of the talent and sweeping through the territories, they talk about how it was time to find the next star. Vince McMahon Sr. had been running with Bob Backlund as champion for about 5 years. And Vince McMahon was looking to replace Bob Backlund, referred to him as milk toast, which got a pop out of me. And Bob Backlund he was very, very milk toast. And Vince McMahon knew that Bob Backlund, as great as a pro wrestler as he was, wasn't going to be somebody to carry the flag and be a national, figurehead or hood ornament to this, huge company anymore. And Vince needed to look elsewhere. And Vince mentioned when he was looking around the landscape of pro wrestling that Dusty Rhodes could be a possibility. When he was trying to think of someone to put in the role that would ultimately become Hulk Hogan's, Dusty was on his radar. Dusty had done business there before. My first ever memories of pro wrestling is seeing pictures of his matches with superstar Billy Graham. Vince McMahon knows Dusty. His dad did business with Dusty and Eddie Graham and whatnot before. And Dusty, even back then, had a shit ton of charisma, was super over, and had connection with an audience that would have brought some of that maybe more mainstream audience. I think Dusty was somebody that could have connected mainstream wise, but he wasn't that larger than life superhero cyborg looking monster that Vince McMahon found in Hulk Hogan. So if they would have attempted to do this with Dusty, I don't think it would have sucked or anything like that, but I don't know if Dusty really would have been the guy to take it to the levels it did. Dusty was popular. He was super over. He would have done fine, but would he have been what Hulk Hogan was? Probably not. And so Vince McMahon says that he saw Rocky. And of course, we all know the story with Hulk Hogan and Vince Sr. when Hogan was working in the WWE as a heel. Wanted to go do the Rocky movie. Vince Sr. didn't want him to, and he said, if you do the movie, you're never going to work here again. Well, then Vince Sr. sells the company to his son. Vince is in charge now. He sees Hogan in the AWA. He sees Hulkamania starting to bubble, starting to get over, starting to gain momentum, and he goes and he steals Hulk Hogan from the AWA and brings him in as WWE's new star. Now, they talk about how Vince McMahon needed to transfer the belt from Bob Backlund to Hulk Hogan, but you can't really do that match, Hogan versus Backlund, because they're both baby faces. So this was pretty much the birth. Well, not the birth, because Ivan Koloff, I think, was a transitional champion. But we've had transitional champions before, and Ivan Koloff and probably Sheik are the most famous ones. And they showed the Sheik beating Bob Backlund, and then I think just a month later, it was January of 1984. And that's when Hogan, who had already previously made his return a couple of weeks ago on TV with Bob Backlund, ironically, beat the Iron Sheik in Madison Square Garden, won the WWE title, and that was pretty much the beginning of what would become this WWE monster. Now, Vince McMahon did say that before his father died, he did say that he was proud of him. Vince McMahon said, I finally got my dad to say he was proud of me. He said that he's always believed that a part of Vince Sr. wanted him to fail. He always felt like his dad kind of wanted him to fail, sort of, or at least a part of him did. So when he saw what Vince was doing and it was becoming the success that it was, he was able to give him a little bit of credit, tell him he was proud of him. And according to Vince, the day before his father passed away, he finally got the "I love you" from his dad. So, of course, nobody can corroborate or confirm these stories other than Vince. So we have to take him at his word. I'm not sure if we should be taking Vince on his word on anything. But he claims that his dad told him that he loved him on the day before he died. They showed some fun footage of Vince McMahon on David Letterman's 3rd anniversary show, and him and Bob Costas were doing they were both reporting from separate maternity wards. It was the 3rd anniversary, and they were doing like if a baby is born during the show, it's going to be like the late night baby, and Vince was reporting from one location, Costas from another. And Vince McMahon, even back then, this would have been like 84 or something, I think, whatever year that was. He was funny. There was Letterman asked him if that was his real tuxedo, and then Vince is like, no, and he kind of made a funny face, and then he kind of, punched back on the line later on. Vince was he didn't seem out of place. He seemed like this was a natural fit for him. He didn't seem like he was out of his league. He was actually pretty witty and kind of fucking charming, to be honest. So that was fun to see all of that. And then they talk about WWE's partnering with MTV. Now, this is going to predate the WrestleManias, but this is when WWE really started to look at expanding their audience. And MTV, man, I remember I was alive when MTV started. I remember my friends, and specifically some older kids, cousins that kind of watched me and babysat me as a kid. Of course, they were into it. I was only 7 or 8 years old, or 5, 6, 7, 8 years old when all this was going on. They were like teenagers and whatnot. So I always remember MTV being on. That's how I got into the stack. That one of these kids just had stacks and stacks of wrestling magazines in his room. And I would sit in there for hours, just looking through them. And that's how I found those pictures of Dusty and Superstar Billy Graham. So MTV was a big deal. And when WWE got on MTV, I remember watching it. And that's pretty much where I really became a fan. Because I already knew of pro wrestling, but I wasn't super interested in it. I just looked through magazines. I was curious. But it wasn't until Hulk Hogan really got on the map that I started really taking interest in it, because it was perfect for me. I was a kid, and this shit is made for kids, or at least the Hulk Hogan character and what WWE would become in the next couple of years was perfect for a fan my age. So I didn't really become a mega fan until like Hogan got on the map. I was only kind of slightly curious about wrestling, but I was more interested in He-Man and whatever the fuck else toys I was playing with at the time. But Hogan coming around, that's what really caught my eye. Him being on MTV, the Cyndi Lauper stuff, the war to settle the score, the brawl to end it all. I remember all of that and watching that. And that was a huge deal for WWE because it gave them an audience, just expanded their audience tenfold with being on a network like that, partnering with MTV, rock and roll wrestling, and having mainstream music stars like Cyndi Lauper being involved in this. And they talked about how Cyndi Lauper met Captain Lou and put him in her music video, and then partnering up with Wendy Richter to kind of, back up Cyndi Lauper. She would wind up winning the championship and all of that. And we had that brawl to end it all and the war to settle the score. Both took place on MTV, which was the precursor to the WrestleMania idea. And that's pretty much when the WrestleMania idea was born, after these MTV specials. And you had all of these celebrities there, the Andy Warhols and the Billy Crystals and the Danny DeVitos, everybody being interviewed for this thing. And that's kind of where the germ of the idea of WrestleMania came to be. And they talked about closed circuit. And this is something I wish I would have been able to do as a kid. WrestleMania 1 and 2, both were available in my area on closed circuit TV, but I didn't go. I don't even think I really asked my dad or my parents to take me, even though I was into wrestling. I don't recall why I wasn't like pushing them. Can we please go see this? But that would have been fun. That's one regret I have as a kid. I wish I would have gone to a closed circuit location. They kind of do that now, where a lot of, Buffalo Wild Wings and sports bars and whatnot play wrestling pay-per-views, but, doing it at a movie theater, I think AEW played around with this a little bit as well. But the closed circuit days were always interesting, and I always wanted to try to do it, but I never did. So the WrestleMania idea is born right around this time. Also, what was going around going on around this time was the John Stossel situation. John Stossel came in under the disguise of talking about Hulk Hogan and his popularity, but then when Hogan is being interviewed, Stossel is asking him questions about blading. So you cut yourself for real, right? Hogan realized, hey, this is a hit piece. He doesn't give a shit about the popularity of Hulk Hogan. He's here to expose wrestling. Goes and tells Vince. Vince basically just gives the boys free reign to do whatever. And that's when Dr. D. David Schultz, a wrestler that I was terrified of as a kid, slaps the shit right out of John Stossel's mouth, knocks him right on his ass. And of course, Schultz, I think, got let go because of that. Stossel wound up suing and got a settlement, but it was probably still pretty sweet to smack that fool in his face. They also showed the Richard Belzer incident, which took place, I believe, like 3 or 4 days before WrestleMania. Hulk Hogan and Mr. T, they're on the promotion tour. They've been doing Saturday Night Live, all the talk shows, and now they're on this Richard Belzer show, and Hogan puts him in a front face lock, and he passes out. And when Hogan lets him go, he falls backwards and smacks his head on the floor. He gets up and sends it to commercial, but you can see blood trickling down the back of his head. Very scary. And of course, Belzer sued WWE for that as well. So imagine that happening right before, just days before WrestleMania 1, and how, horrible timing that was. But WrestleMania turned out to be such a huge success. A lot of that stuff was forgotten about. And the thing about the John Stossel and Richard Belzer stuff, if that would have been now, it would have been all over Twitter. It would have been all over social media. You would have seen clips of this passed around over and over and over. There was really none of that going on. I never knew about the John Stossel stuff until like after well, no, maybe I knew about Stossel. I think it was the Richard Belzer thing. I didn't know until like 3 years later. So I remember being like 11 and learning about that. I'm like, I had no idea that even fucking happened. So, back then it was different, even though that could have hurt the publicity of WrestleMania. It was a different age in terms of information, getting out there quickly. And unless you happen to be watching that night or your local news picked up on it or something, I don't know where you'd have seen that happen. We're so early in, the cable TV world. So WrestleMania 1 happens. They show all the highlights from that. Of course, it's a huge success, and many people look at that night as the night that Vince won the war. The territories would still stick around. The NWA and the AWA and Mid-South and various places would still stick around and still do relatively decent business. But in terms of WWE being slowed down or stopped, it was the opposite. They were growing and becoming even bigger. And that pretty much concluded episode 1. We then move on to episode 2, and this one's entitled Heat. So this is going to be about a lot of the scandals and whatnot, but they're also going to have some WrestleMania history here as well. Now, they started off this episode called Heat with the introduction of Saturday night's main event. They got the deal with NBC to be on NBC quarterly, every 3 months when Saturday Night Live was off. And they discussed and talked about the importance of being on network TV. And I'll tell you, man, those Saturday night's main events, those were a big deal. And we're about to get them back here in December. And as a kid, I don't know where I would be without Saturday night's main event. It was such a big deal when you knew it was coming on and you would look forward to it. And I would stay up late, and I just remember I had one of those TVs that like sat on the floor that was in the box. It's probably only like a 19 or 23 inch TV, but it had that big box case around it, sat right on the floor, right where you put your cable box and your Nintendo on top, shit like that. And I'll never forget like how many Saturday night's main events I watched sitting on the floor in my parents' house living room, lights off. I'm the only one in the living room, a wide array of snacks, in front of me, watching great matches, because on the weekend shows, Superstars and Challenge and whatnot, it was enhancement matches. That's all you got. It was just jobber matches. That's it. Sometimes there would be one feature, but even on primetime wrestling, you'd probably get one feature match and then a whole lot of bullshit. So if there was a Saturday night's main event that night, on Saturday, I'm watching Superstars that afternoon. I remember when I lived in North Carolina, Superstars aired at like noon Eastern on Saturdays. So I would watch Superstars on Saturdays, and they would promote the matches for Saturday night's main event later on that night. And I was stoked. And I'll always remember like thumbing through the TV guide. They would come out, like a month in advance, and I would look through all the Saturdays because that was the only way you knew. It's not like WWE would let you know when the next one was, or anything. You just had to kind of guess, or at least for a kid anyway. Maybe if you were older, it was easier to keep track. But I would always look through the TV guide. And if I saw Saturday night's main event on in the TV guide for like 2 weeks, I would look forward to it. I would anticipate it. I would love it. So they talked about the importance of that. They talked about the crazy schedule. Now during this time and era in WWE, the majority of their revenue is live event and ticket sales and things like that, unlike today, very unlike today. And they talked about the crazy schedule, the grueling schedule. And wrestlers always exaggerate with them. It's always 52 weeks a year, 365 days a year, 7 days a week. They work every day. They never have a day off. That is bullshit. Even in the craziest of schedules, you do have days off. Ric Flair claimed he wrestled Ricky Steamboat more times than there are days in his life. So wrestlers always have a tendency to really inflate and exaggerate how much they work. I get it. They're being ran into the fucking ground. Everybody knows that. Their fingers and, and arms and legs are being just worked to the bone. We know that. But stop with the 7 days a week bullshit. You are not wrestling 7 days a week. You're not. You never have. Ever. So that drives me nuts when wrestlers say they work 365, 7 days a week. You might be on the road a lot more days than you're actually wrestling. Yes, but you are not. They make it sound like they haven't seen the inside of their home in years. And that's bullshit. They probably see the inside of their home several times a month, even in the craziest of schedules. But that doesn't mean the schedules weren't crazy. That doesn't mean the schedules weren't grueling. They were. And this is when, around 1986, when Jesse Ventura attempted to unionize and started going around and trying to get the boys to unite and form a union to protect themselves. And this is right around the same time of WrestleMania 2, when they're going to attempt to go to 3 cities. And Hulk Hogan, we've heard Jesse over the years say, that he learned during the steroid trial and all that Hulk Hogan was the one that stooged him off to Vince about unionization. And then Vince, was able to kill it. And Hogan admits this. Hogan admits that he heard about this and he went and told Vince McMahon. And one thing that, even though that's really shitty of Hulk Hogan to do, and I'm certainly not defending Hulk Hogan at all, but they're right. Vince McMahon, Tony Atlas, Dave Meltzer, everybody, in the documentary basically said the same thing. And that is that the boys would have never stuck together. They had no loyalty to anyone except themselves and their own families and their own money, which is why a lot of them left the territories. Like I said, a few stayed out of loyalty, but for the most part, if Vince McMahon threw money at you, you left because it's better for you. It's just business. That's it. So Vince McMahon went around and said, hey, if anybody attends this meeting, then, I'm going to cut your contract or kill you. You're not going to work for me anymore. And Vince McMahon threatened, to stop using them if they went to this meeting. And of course, everybody, decided to stay. But even if Hogan wouldn't have stooged off Jesse, I question whether or not it would have worked also, because you're asking wrestlers in the 80s, you're asking coked up, freaked out, roid-raged wrestlers to all get along and play nice and play happy for the good of the business. Nobody gave a shit. So I'm not really sure if that would have even worked back in those days. So the fact that Jesse tried to unionize, it's kind of moot because they would have never stuck together anyway. They also acknowledged the mistake of attempting to go live from 3 locations at WrestleMania 2 in 1986, which still blows my mind. I mean, that was 38 years ago now. It's almost 40 years ago that they did that, and they have never done it since. And think about the technology. We have the technology to do it pretty easily now, but they don't even want to attempt it anymore. And I think it was crazy that they tried to do it in 1986, and it worked okay. WrestleMania was all right. I'll never forget my memory of WrestleMania 2. I didn't see it live, didn't go to closed circuit. I remember the next day, the Detroit Free Press, on like the sports page, there was a big black and white picture. My dad showed it to me, and it was when when Bundy was bleeding, but it was in black and white. It was when Hogan was standing over him, like kind of punching him. And that was when the blood started running down Bundy's face and had the big headline, Hogan clobbers Bundy. And that's how I found out that Hogan retained the title. Even though watching on TV, I wasn't too worried about him dropping it. But then again, I was only 9. So I was relieved that Hulkamania survived at WrestleMania 2. Damn near came to a close, though, at WrestleMania 3. They told this story. They told the story of how Andre the Giant was filming The Princess Bride, and Vince McMahon flew over there during the production of the movie and pitched this whole thing. and Andre had the bad back at the time. And it's weird. They've told this story a couple of times where Vince went to Andre and said, and Andre's like, I have a bad back. And Vince said here in the documentary, he told Andre to get the back surgery and come back and work with Hogan. But Andre got the back surgery after WrestleMania 3, not before WrestleMania 3. If you watch WrestleMania 3, he's wearing that big back brace. And after WrestleMania 3, he's gone until Survivor Series. He's not on TV. So, or he's not in the ring anyway. He appeared, later in the year on some Saturday Night's Main Events. But in terms of being in the ring, he didn't get back in the ring until Survivor Series. So he had all that recovery time. That's when he got the surgery done. But before that, Vince McMahon convinced him to come back and work this program with Hogan. And it was funny how they talked about WWE. And I remember this as a kid, them pushing the narrative that Hogan didn't know that he was winning until the end of the match. That was ridiculous. They talked about how they were blatantly lying about Andre the Giant being undefeated, about Andre the Giant never facing Hulk Hogan, never being body slammed. And I remember the build to that, man. This was right in my city. I was living there right in the middle of all this and watching these Piper's Pits on Superstars and you could tell in that very first Piper's Pit where Andre walked away as a kid, I'm like, oh shit. I know what they're doing. Like I saw it coming, like from that very first one, that subtle tease by Andre. I'm like, oh no. And then it gets to the final one where Heenan shows up with Andre, and the way that whole thing was set up. As a kid, it really did feel like this was a dream match. But because of my previous upbringing and that room that my cousin had stacked to the ceiling with wrestling magazines, I saw plenty of pictures of Hulk Hogan facing Andre the Giant. And I remember trying to convince people at the bus stop, no, this match has happened before. I can't prove it. I just know that it did. Oh, Andre's never been slammed. I'm like, yes, he has. I've seen it. And I was trying to explain it, but I couldn't prove anything. I'm just like a kid. And I'm like, no, I swear I've seen pictures. All I had was magazines. That's it. The only evidence I had was what my own eyes saw in a magazine 3 years prior. And back then I'm 6. So I'm trying to explain this and no. And WWE did a great job of pushing this as the real deal, because if you're a kid, what the fuck do you know? It's not like now where you can just go on and Google Hogan and Andre and see the 25 matches they had prior to WrestleMania 3. It was the same deal as, Bon Jovi has AIDS, Brutus Beefcake and Hulk Hogan are brothers, that type of thing. Just these rumors you hear as a kid. There's really no way to disprove them. It's just all a matter of hearsay and rumors and whatnot. So I just remember kind of the chatter around that match, being a kid, and how WWE was pushing the narrative. But even though I had some vague flashbulb memories of knowing Hogan and Andre had faced before, I didn't care. I was 100% balls deep into this. I was mesmerized by this feud. It really did feel larger than life. Hulk Hogan, by that point, already felt like an invincible superhero. And I had just come off of playing with action figures and stuff. I'd moved on to wrestling now. I wasn't really into He-Man or anything, but that's what I was into prior to WWE. So to me, Hulk Hogan was kind of like this meld of this He-Man superhero character. He already felt unbeatable. He was beaten, he had just beaten Kamala, and I was really scared of Kamala, that he could beat Hogan and win the title. And after Hogan got rid of him, I'm like, man, nobody can stop Hogan. And then in walks Andre, and I was scared. I was legitimately scared. I'm like, oh my God, I think Andre is going to wipe the floor with Hulk Hogan possibly. And the way they were building it and billing it as this just mega match, it was perfect. I mean, it really, really was perfect. And then of course they talked all about the success of WrestleMania 3. They talked about the attendance figure from the 93,000 to the 78 that Dave was claiming to the 80,000 that it probably was. Either way, it's like the all-in thing. It doesn't matter. Look, there's a shitload of people. If you want to litigate and really break down the actual legitimate number in the turnstiles or whatever, to me, that's kind of not the point. The point is this was a show that already shattered a lot of records and was doing things that pro wrestling had never done before. Why WWE wants to inflate and exaggerate everything, I don't know. That 93,173 number has been in all of our heads for years. That's what Mean Gene announced to all of us, that night, that was the attendance. So WWE has always exaggerated everything, and I don't really care too much. To me, the visual of that crowd is one of the more impressive things. You know, now WWE's got a lot of great visual crowds from all the WrestleManias, that one in Dallas with 100,000 people, and all the lighting and the lasers and the production. But back then in '87, that was just raw. That was just raw. The sunlight was what was lighting the building, not the lights, because it's a dome. And, it would get really dark by the time we got to the main event. But when it was still light, just that sea of people, that's what pro wrestling should be proud of. So WWE didn't really need to exaggerate the number. They could have counted the number legit and announced it that night, and it still would have been a huge success. But it was kind of funny to hear them talk about that. And of course, Hogan, has always pushed this idea that I've always been speculative of, about how Andre the Giant, or he didn't know if Andre the Giant was going to cooperate. And he said this for years, and I've always called bullshit on it. And then a few years ago, I went on the Jericho cruise, and Jake Roberts had like a one-man show or a podcast, and he kind of said the same thing. And I'm like, maybe this is the one rare time that Hogan is telling the truth, but it's just really hard for me to believe that Vince McMahon, with the biggest show of his life and his company's life, and a lot, this is a huge deal for them, and he's going to let their main event go out there without knowing what's going to happen. He's going to let that match happen with the possibility of Andre just saying, nope, I don't want to lose, and pin Hogan. This is supposed to make Hogan like Hogan. I mean, if Hogan wasn't already made already, this is what's going to solidify him as the greatest of fucking all time. So this idea that the body slam wasn't planned, the pin wasn't planned, bullshit. The fuck it wasn't. Vince McMahon, who was so obsessively protective of his business. Granted, Andre is a giant. Andre can do what he wants. Nobody can make Andre do anything. But I would like to think they're just fucking with Hogan, and Andre and Vince had an agreement. Andre always knew what he was going to do. Vince always knew what the finish was going to be. There was never any doubt in Vince McMahon's mind or Andre the Giant's mind. The only way this makes sense if Andre was legitimately not telling Hogan, never had any intention of not doing the right thing, but just made Hogan think that it was all going to be called in the ring, I guess. But I still find that very crazy that Hogan would be willing to go out in front of that many people, knowing that if the big guy changes his mind, I'm going to get humiliated in front of damn near 100,000 people. I've never believed it. Still don't. But they talk about the success of WrestleMania 3, how that made Hulk Hogan, and now how Hulk Hogan had movie aspirations. And so Vince thought that one good way to maybe keep him away from Hollywood was to come up with, let's just do a movie in the No Holds Barred movie. So they show all of the footage from No Holds Barred. Then they move on to WrestleMania 6 and talk about the match with the Ultimate Warrior and the torch passing that took place there and that whole deal. So, now we're up until WrestleMania 6, and then it's time to move into WrestleMania 7. So they touch on how the Warrior really wasn't working out. He was popular, but wasn't as popular as Hulk Hogan. And then they're going to make the pivot to go back to Hogan and use Sergeant Slaughter as the transitional champion and the Iraqi sympathizer. But because of the sensitivity of the angle and the fact that, you could have people at home who's got a son or a daughter or a loved one, fighting in that war over there, and then you've got this angle going on TV, it was kind of in bad taste and poor taste, and they kind of had to scale back a little bit. And that's part of the reason why, they didn't have this match or the WrestleMania in the Coliseum, and they had to go indoors with a much smaller crowd. And of course, Sergeant Slaughter was getting death threats and whatnot. But, basically as a fan, I was living it during this time. I was 14 years old. I remember all of this. And when you think of WrestleMania 3, WrestleMania 4, WrestleMania 5, WrestleMania 6, I had some pretty fond memories. And this Slaughter feud just wasn't doing it for me. It was way too obvious of what was going to happen. And when you're watching this, even as a kid who was 13, 14 years old, as I was, 1 trillion %, the minute Slaughter wins that championship, that he's going to drop it to Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania. There is no way Slaughter, this Iraqi sympathizer, evil heel, is going to beat the Warrior at the Royal Rumble, then go into WrestleMania and beat Hulk Hogan. It was way too predictable. It was way too been there, done that. And I think that's why it failed to capture the attention. That's why it failed to sell the tickets. And that's why they had to scale it back. And so they kind of talked about that. And then we fast forward to, well, not fast forward, it was all pretty much happening the same year, the George Zahorian trial. George Zahorian is indicted in 1991 under suspicion of steroid distribution, and there was a lot of information and clips of him showing him on WWE TV back in the day. So basically, he was WWE's appointed on-site physician who would prescribe and sell drugs to talent, including steroids. And Vince McMahon has always admitted that he did purchase steroids from Zahorian back when they were legal, because they were legal at first. But then when they became an illegal substance, that's when WWE started getting in trouble. Zahorian wound up being indicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison. This is around the same time that Vince McMahon had started the WBF. And of course, the WBF is a bodybuilding federation. And when your company doctor has just been sentenced to prison due to steroid distribution, you can't really continue that brand. And so they went ahead and folded the WBF. So that's, one of Vince's non-wrestling failures that he would encounter in his life. And during this, because of that trial, it was revealed which wrestlers received steroids from George Zahorian, and Hulk Hogan was on that list. And there was a really funny video, or kind of like disturbing video, of Vince McMahon, kind of doing a PR piece in front of the WWE logo in, reassuring fans that they are watching a drug-free and steroid-free WWE. And when he's done with it and they go to cut, he just goes, and he just like makes this face. Like, it was just the worst thing he ever had to do. It was like when Ultimate Warrior had to make the apology to that kid, and he was just kicking and screaming the whole fucking time. So Vince, they're trying to scale back a little bit now, trying to get off, the steroid stuff, letting a lot of talent go. And then Hulk Hogan goes on the Arsenio Hall show and lies about taking steroids. And Hogan admits that it was a dumb and bad idea. Even Vince McMahon was upset that he just didn't come clean and didn't tell the truth. It would have been better for everybody if he did. As we know, Hulk Hogan is a chronic pathological liar anyway, but at least this is one lie where Hogan admits that it was stupid. Enter Phil Mushnick. Everybody knows, most people know who Phil Mushnick is. He has been the New York Post's television and radio columnist since 1982, and he has waged a decades-long war and vendetta against Vince McMahon and the WWE. And he began writing columns, after the Zahorian trial, exposing WWE. And Vince McMahon, on the documentary, talks about Mushnick and wonders out loud why he has such a vendetta against him. And then they immediately cut to Phil Mushnick saying, because he's a dirtbag, which I popped for. And at the time, I was never a big Phil Mushnick fan. I felt like he was attacking a little bit of me too, especially like in the mid-90s there when his stuff started to resurface again, and Jim Cornette was dropping those promos on Mushnick, and some of the things that Mushnick wrote about Brian Pillman and whatnot was, not only rubbing WWE the wrong way, but some fans. But when you look at it now in retrospect, Mushnick, his vendetta against Vince and WWE was pretty well founded. He was witnessing a lot of fucked up things happening that the regular media didn't want to touch because it's just attached to phony wrestling. Who cares about what's going on there? But Mushnick was the guy that recognized that real, actual lives were being damaged and abused. And so even though maybe 25 years ago I wanted to wring the fucker's neck, I'm actually happy he did what he did. Because without him really kind of getting the ball rolling, who knows how long Vince McMahon and WWE would have been able to get away with so much effed up stuff that they were doing. And so Mushnick was the first person to actually have a heart and actually care about people. Who cares if it's attached to wrestling? If lives are being abused, this needs to be exposed. So he was the one that kind of first got the ball rolling on that. And Mushnick claims he got a lot of those stories from others about, the true nature of what was going on. And Tony Atlas then admits how badly women were being abused. And they brought up the Jimmy Superfly Snuka situation and the murder of his girlfriend that he finally paid for way late in life, right before his death. And they allude that Vince McMahon might have had something to do with it, and might have had something to do with that going away, because at the time that was pre-Hogan, and Jimmy Snuka, prior to Hogan getting there, was WWE's biggest, most over babyface that Vince McMahon didn't want to lose. And there's always been rumors about Vince McMahon's involvement in what might have been Snuka getting out of those initial charges, especially when the detective who was there wanted it, or the coroner or whoever was there when she was killed wanted it investigated as a homicide, and just something kind of prevented that. So they talked about that, and then it was time to talk about the Ring Boy scandal, which of course was super fucked up. This involved Mel Phillips, Terry Garvin, and Pat Patterson. The first Ring Boy to come forward was Tom Cole, who claimed that, he was groped and things like that. And even Bret Hart said that Mel Phillips was a total pedophile, and he had like ring boys that he would bring, and they would abuse them or try to coerce them into sexual acts and just horribly disgusting stuff. And Tony Atlas claimed that Pat Patterson grabbed his pecker in the locker room. And, there's been a lot of rumors and accusations towards Pat Patterson. And I wasn't there to say if they were true or false. I will say this, though. If somebody repeatedly grabbed my pecker without permission, I would not go live in a house with that person. Remember Legend's house? These guys were roommates. If you were sexually abused by someone, or they did something to you sexually that you did not ask for, would you coexist with them, cohabitate with them? Why? It's not like, what does Tony Atlas have to be afraid of? He's not scared of Pat. I think Tony Atlas took the payday. Yeah, I'll stay in the house with them. I'm getting paid for it. So Atlas obviously didn't let that get in the way of his Legends house gig. But Pat Patterson was involved in a lot of these accusations. And then they showed the Phil Donahue show, which still to this day, if you've never seen it, you have to go watch that Phil Donahue show with Vince McMahon sitting right next to Dave Meltzer with the sweetest mullet of all time. Bruno Sammartino is there. Superstar Billy Graham is there. I think Tom Cole is there. Barry O. Everybody that was around at that time that was part of that scandal was there. And Vince admits on the documentary that it probably wasn't the best idea, but he's always had that mentality of when he feels like he's being attacked, he wants to fight, and he wanted to go on Donahue and defend himself, but that was just a bad place to do it, because this is a studio audience talk show where you're going to look like nothing but the heel, and the audience is going to get on your case, and he was being ganged up on by everybody. Not that they weren't all right, and these fucked up things were happening and needed to be dealt with. Vince didn't put himself in a very good position there, and kind of admitted to that. And after that, if that sex scandal wasn't enough, and Vince talked about how it was coming at him from all directions, well, that's because he was accused of rape by Rita Chatterton, Rita Marie, the first lady referee who they tried to initially make a big deal. Vince even had her on TNT, on Tuesday Night Titans, as a guest one time. And she claimed that Vince McMahon had forced himself on her. And when she denied his advances, Vince denied the rapes, but Rita claimed that Vince sexually forced himself onto her. And shortly after that, she was fired and let go. So Vince, of course, denies the rape, but he does admit the affair. So he admits the affair. And then right after that, he says something really disturbing. He says, well, even if it was rape, the statute of limitations is expired. What? That's like OJ writing the book. I didn't do it, but here's how I would if I did. Jesus Christ, Vince. That's like the equivalent of, when somebody's, hooking up with a really, really, underage person. Well, it's consensual at this age or whatever. I'm like, well, it's still fucking gross, So, Vince saying that was just wild to me. But he's always denied the rape allegations and just said it was a consensual affair, which seems to be a theme in Vince's life. And again, no one seemed to really care about it except for Phil Mushnick. And it was his articles about that and a lot of these other scandals that triggered the federal indictment over steroid distribution on Vince McMahon. And now we're moving into the steroid trial. So during the steroid trial, this is when Vince is actually put on trial. And this is a lot of this. This is because Phil Mushnick did not let up. After the Zahorian case and then some of these other scandals had taken place, Mushnick continued to write these articles exposing some of the ugliness in WWE, which caught the attention of, federal investigators, and they wound up indicting Vince over steroid distribution and encouraging his wrestlers to take steroids. So they chronicled all of this. Now, this was an interesting time because Hulk Hogan had signed with WCW right in the middle of this trial going on. They talked about Vince having neck surgery to kind of gain sympathy, from the jurors and whatnot. And how Hulk Hogan was going to be the star witness. He was granted immunity if he would go on and testify against Vince McMahon. And the prosecutors were banking on that Hogan especially would say that Vince McMahon told him to take steroids or encouraged him to take steroids or instructed him to take steroids. And that was pretty much the end of this episode, with them showing some text at the end saying Vince McMahon dropped his defamation lawsuit against Rita Chatterton and Geraldo, because Chatterton was on Geraldo talking about this incident that took place with Vince McMahon, and Vince McMahon sued them both. He dropped that lawsuit in 1994, probably right after he got acquitted for the steroid trial, and he was, just trying to put everything behind him there. But then he wound up settling. As we know, we talked about this here on the podcast last year, that he settled with Rita Chatterton in 2023 after a temporary lift on the statute of limitations for victims of sexual offenses in the state of New York took place. So they lifted it, allowing her to get a settlement from WWE. And that was pretty much the end of episode 2. And we now move into episode 3. And this one is entitled Screwjob. So we know what this one is going to be about. Before we get into Screwjob, let's just take a quick pause. Let me go over here to the chat real quick and make sure nothing crazy is going on. If you don't mind, do me a favor and smash that thumbs up button for me. And I would appreciate it. Okay, looks like we're good. I want to thank Chris Ludek. What's up, man? What about the Hogan? He wrestled 400 times in a year. That's right. He's had a lot of double shots, man. A lot of double shots. All right, cool. I'm caught up on the chat. Just wanted to make sure that's all good. And we will move on now to episode 3 entitled Screwjob. So we will be getting a lot of Screwjob stuff here. We've talked about the Screwjob in length. Last year, or I guess it was 2022, so I guess it's been almost 2 years ago now, but I did upload a big, long 25th anniversary podcast on the Screwjob. So if you want to hear me talk about the ins and outs of that, check out that video. But this episode would get into a lot of the Screwjob, and it opened up with Wendy Richter, the original Screwjob, when she was ladies champion and she didn't want to give the belt back up, and they showed that horrible debacle with Spider Lady and them trying to get the belt back off of her and whatnot. And then they pick back up with the steroid trial and wrap that up. So Hogan is on trial or Hogan is testifying. I'm sorry, Vince is on trial. Hogan is at the trial testifying against Vince McMahon. And he tells the jury that Vince McMahon never told him to take steroids. And it was because of that testimony that got Vince acquitted. And Vince retold the story of hearing the verdict come in, because Vince, they wanted him to cop a plea, which I guess would have not even resulted in jail time for him. And he said no, and was willing to take this to trial. And normally in these cases, there's a very high conviction rate. And he wound up getting acquitted. And he said it was like, the biggest weight lifted off his shoulders. It was awesome. And it was like right back to business as soon as that trial was over. But, the damage was kind of done. The business did suffer during that time. Some executives left. There was terrible attendance. And of course, Hulk Hogan went to WCW during this time. Eric Bischoff told the story of how he was there. At the same time, Hogan was filming Thunder in Paradise, got Hogan to sign. And it was when Hogan was I think already under contract at WCW, was when he testified in the trial. So all that happening at the same time was very crazy. And they talked about WWE's attempt to make Lex Luger the next Hulk Hogan, but how that just didn't work and how Bret Hart really had to step up and lead the new generation. And they also talked about Randy Savage departing the company. And I've talked about that many times, how that still is the hardest thing for me to to this day, it was still one of the hardest defections. It just really, really rocked me at the time. Personally, I remember when it happened and how bummed out I was that Savage left. And I think that was really difficult on Vince McMahon as well. And then they talked about how WCW was starting to change and make changes and sign a lot of WWE talent. And the big move came when Ted Turner gave Eric Bischoff 2 hours every Monday night on TNT during a meeting where Ted Turner asked Eric directly how he can compete with WWE. And Bischoff said they have a better time slot. They're prime time on Monday nights. And so Ted goes, you can have prime time on Monday nights too. And that was the debut of Monday Nitro. And they told the story of Lex Luger's debut as WWE tried to make him the next Hogan. It didn't really pan out. His contract was up, and they talked about how he was able to leave WWE and show up on Monday Nitro. It was funny because Luger the last time he was on WWE TV was SummerSlam. And that was a couple of weeks before, maybe 3 weeks before the first Monday Nitro. But on the documentary, they show a clip of SummerSlam 1995, but they put the date as September 3rd, and they called it a house show. And I do believe Luger did work a house show on Sunday night or something like that. Or yeah, Sunday night. And then went to WCW the next day. I don't recall if it was Sunday or the day before, but it was real close. But his last TV appearance was SummerSlam. And then I guess WWE was under the impression he was going to stick around, but contractually he was free to do whatever he wanted. So he showed up on the very first Monday Nitro, and they showed all of that. And, Eric, continues to, Bischoff is on this thing, of course, and he continues to push this narrative that, he was going to compete with WWE because their stories were still very childlike and, geared towards kids, and he wanted his stories to be more adult-oriented. But that didn't really happen until the NWO came around. Before Hall and Nash signed, it was very hokey. They had Dungeon of Doom. They had a lot of stupid characters. I mean, God bless Canyon, but Mortis was dumb. Glacier was dumb. They had everything going on with the Dungeon of Doom was just silly. The Zodiac and the Taskmaster and all this stuff was just hokey and dumb. Avalanche. And all these characters they had, they really weren't any better than WWE. The more adult stuff felt like that didn't get there until Hall and Nash signed. And then it became cool. NWO was cool. There was nothing cool about Elizabeth taking off her high heel shoe and bonking Savage in the head or whatever the hell they were doing in 1995. So Bischoff always thinks that his stuff was more adult oriented. It wasn't. It wasn't until Hall and Nash got there and they made it that way. It had nothing to do with you. Eazy-E. They talked about Bischoff giving away the results of Monday Night Raw. Vince, of course, no selling this. They showed clips of Alundra Blaze dropping the ladies' title in the trash can. And then they talked about the Billionaire Ted skits. And, I remember liking those when they came out. I remember being happy that WWE was at least finally acknowledging WCW and acknowledging this company that's attacking them so viciously, and they haven't said anything in return. And so when I saw these skits, I'm like, good. It's about time you let these fuckers have it. But, in retrospect, they really weren't that good of an idea. They made WWE look arguably worse than before they aired those. And then the funniest thing is when they even showed on the documentary a video of Ted Turner himself watching those and laughing his ass off. So right there, that kills it. They shrugged it off. He thought it was funny. He enjoyed them. He really wasn't offended. The person who was offended was Kay Koplovitz, who was friends with Ted Turner. And she was running USA Network at the time. And she kind of killed that and said, you guys got to stop doing that. And Bruce Pritchard said that that's when he figured out Razor and Diesel were leaving because they were asked to be in a Billionaire Ted skit and they didn't want to do it. And that was kind of like the first clue or the writing on the wall that they were actually going to leave. And then they talked about the whole curtain call story. Of course, we know about that. We've talked about that until we're blue in the face as well. Curtain call in Madison Square Garden, Razor and Diesel's last night. And, how they came together and all hugged, and it was breaking kayfabe. And then they went into a description of what kayfabe was. And Undertaker specifically was always very protective of kayfabe. Hilarious clips. I loved some of this footage they showed of Taker, Razor, Goldust, Brett, I think all at the headquarters playing video game. The video game, they must have been there for promotion for that or to film a commercial or something, but they were all in their gear, and Undertaker's got all his Undertaker makeup on, and he's watching Goldust and whoever play the video game, and he's like rolling his eyes. Hilarious stuff. Those are the type of things I would like to see. Think about how much footage exists, just outtakes, just cameras rolling, but nothing going on. Just countless millions of hours of that type of stuff probably exist. And man, I would love to see some of it. They talked about Triple H being punished for the curtain call because Hall and Nash left. Shawn was champ. Triple H had to eat his plates and plates of shit. So they kind of rehashed that. And now Hall and Nash joined WCW. And this was pretty good. Hall and Nash joining WCW, they talked about them going there. They talked about the lawsuit because WWE felt like they were portraying Razor and Diesel and stealing their intellectual property. And Vince was talking about how they stole them. And Vince said, Vince is trying to be, how Bischoff put it, he was in sympathetic babyface mode, conveniently forgetting that the exact same thing he's complaining about here is what he did to the territories. Vince is saying, oh, they're stealing our talent. We made these people who they were, and then they took them from us. And so the producers basically asked Vince about this. Vince is asked about similarities to Ted Turner's, quote, predatory practices is what Vince called it. And they asked about the similarities between Ted's predatory practices and himself. And Vince didn't really seem to have a good answer, but he acknowledged the hypocrisy. I think he knew as he was talking that he can't really complain about this happening to him because this is just business. This is the same thing that he did to the territories. Those stars that he took were created and made. Granted, he often took them to the next level, but a lot of stars, like the Junkyard Dogs and the Greg Valentines and, the Roddy Pipers and the Hulk Hogans and the Jesse Venturas, all that talent that came in, Tito Santana, they were already established names. They were made somewhere else and he took them. Now, years later, karma is coming back to bite him in his pasty ass, and now he's butthurt about it. And the producers calling him out for that, I'm glad, because it's the exact same thing. I mean, at the time, I was on the WWE side of the Monday Night Wars, but I understood, I didn't like it, but it's like, shit, this is kind of what goes around comes around. I'm a big believer in that. And it came around hard on Vince here, and WWE, found themselves as the number 2 promotion for the first time in their history. They showed the formation of the NWO with Hulk Hogan, and Vince said that him and Hogan never really considered ever turning Hogan heel. Hogan could have been heel in WWE. They could have done this over there, but they never did, never even considered it. And he went over there and made history in WCW instead. WCW would then dominate WWE in the ratings. Eric Bischoff turns heel first, joining the NWO. And another interesting point they brought up here about Vince McMahon, which I always found interesting too back in the day. But whenever Vince McMahon, you could get him to talk about his competition back then in the 90s, it was always Ted Turner. There was 2 things that he never said. He never said WCW. He refused to speak their name. And he never spoke Eric Bischoff's name either. Everything was Time Warner or Ted Turner. And he did this. And Bischoff, brings up a good point here. He does this. He doesn't want to bring up Eric Bischoff's name. This is a guy that's been in that position for a year and a half. Vince McMahon's doing this his whole life. Bischoff's been in this position for a year and a half, and he's taken WCW to the number 1 wrestling company. So Vince McMahon focusing his energy on Ted Turner and speaking about his competition like it's Ted Turner in his big wallet makes Vince seem like the underdog, makes Vince seem like the babyface. And Vince always just mentioned Ted Turner's organization. He always said that, Ted Turner's organization or Time Warner's organization. Never would he never said the letters WCW until they bought them. I don't recall any interview, anywhere where Vince McMahon publicly said WCW out loud until he purchased them. Before then, it was always Turner's organization or Ted Turner. Nothing about Bischoff, nothing about WCW. And that was a good point that Bischoff brought up because it made him feel like the underdog against the mighty Ted Turner instead of Bischoff being the underdog against the mighty Vince McMahon. So they moved now on to all those people that WWE has lost and how Vince McMahon couldn't let Bret Hart go. So they talked about Bret's 20-year contract, chronicled all of the heat that he had with Shawn Michaels. I invite you to go watch my Montreal Screwjob 25th anniversary video I did a couple years ago, if you want my comments on all of this. And they talk about, Survivor Series. They rehash the Screwjob. They show the footage of all of that. And there was a funny comment, of course, at the end of the match after Bret is screwed, he hawks the big loogie on Vince McMahon's face. And him and Vince both comment on the loogie. Bret's like, when you're wrestling, you accumulate a lot of froth, in your mouth. And he goes, and I spit. And he goes, just bullseye. And Vince was like, he goes, I was so mad. He goes, but I was so impressed, like how he was able to do that. So that was kind of funny hearing them joke about the loogie. Showed a lot of footage from Wrestling with Shadows. And Bret, too, kind of debunks the story of the punch, the locker room punch. Vince has always told the story that he went into Bret's locker room to allow him to hit him. He felt like he owed it to Bret to give Bret a free shot. And Bret's like, that's bullshit. He goes, I don't know why they pushed this like it was a free shot. He goes, we tied up. He goes, we locked up. And Bret has, even from the very beginning, Bret has always said that it was an uppercut. So, if it's just a standing punch and Vince is unprotected, I don't know if you're really going to hit him with an uppercut. You might. An uppercut sounds more like when you're tied up and your heads are down and you just come up, and that's how Bret described it. He was like, it was like when you hit the thing at the fair, the circus, and you hit the bell and it goes ka-ching or whatever. He goes, that's kind of how it was with his uppercut on Vince, got him right in the temple and knocked him right out. And so that was interesting that Vince kind of makes it sound like he let Bret hit him when really it was more of a tie-up. And Vince has always also told the story about how he tripped on like Gerald Briscoe's ankle. And that's how Vince was walking around with a limp, because everybody was falling all over each other. So because of this screw job, this is basically where Vince McMahon is born. The Mr. McMahon character is born. And that's how the episode closes. And we move into now episode 4, entitled Attitude. And this is where WWE really goes hard with the Vince McMahon stuff. But before we get there, we learn, some of the origins of where Vince McMahon would get his attitude from. And it's well documented. Vince has talked about this for years and years and years and decades, that his favorite wrestler of all time was Dr. Jerry Graham. Now, Dr. Jerry Graham, of course, he's the founder of the fictitious Graham family, which includes himself, Jerry Graham, Eddie Graham, who, of course, ran Florida, Crazy Luke Graham, Mike Graham, and also superstar Billy Graham. So a lot of Grahams. And he would, he had the Cadillac or the convertible, and he drove like a maniac. He lit the cigars with $100 bills and took Vince McMahon on a ride in his car one day. And Vince just got a raging huge erection for this guy from day one. And he was always Vince McMahon's favorite wrestler. So we're in the aftermath of the screw job now. We get the Bret screwed Bret speech on TV, which I think at the time Vince assumed would make him the babyface. It did not. Kind of made him a heel. And then WWE started deciding to move into this, new type of way of producing content. And that's when Vince McMahon does that December 1997 promo where he's announcing this new era, saying that the fans are tired of having their intelligence insulted and they're going to move on to this more invigorating and extemporaneous product and all this crap, right? And so that's kind of where the Attitude Era was born. And they also point to an incident that took place earlier in 1997 when Shawn Michaels came out on Raw with a bunch of gauze stuck down his pants. I think Vince was not at TV that night and kind of misbehaved a little bit, got himself fined, but was able to wiggle his way out of the fine after they convinced Vince that that's the direction they need to go in. So then Degeneration X is born. Vince McMahon at first is a little bit freaked out, yelling at Triple H and Shawn Michaels, "You're going to get us thrown off the air," until he realizes that that's really working. And then once they realized that was working, then the floodgates opened up. Stone Cold got on the map. They showed all of Stone Cold Steve Austin's history in ECW and how he came to the WWE, winning the King of the Ring, the Austin 316 promo, and Austin, kind of getting rolling and getting on the map. And then in the beginning of 1998, they bring in Mike Tyson. And one of the funniest clips on the whole documentary in all 6 episodes is when Stephanie, they're showing a clip of an interview with her from 2013. And they're talking about Mike Tyson. And they said, did you have any reservations about doing business with him, after, the being sent to prison for rape? And she's like, well, he hadn't gotten accused of rape yet, right? And then she looks to the side. Somebody's like, no, he did. And she goes, he did? And somebody had spliced in the clip perfectly with an ending of Curb Your Enthusiasm. Just made me laugh so hard that Stephanie didn't know that the rape stuff had already happened. Mike Tyson was released from prison after being found guilty of rape and sentenced to prison. He got released 3 years before he even did business with WWE. So the fact that Stephanie didn't know that, and they showed a clip of that, made me laugh my ass off. But Bischoff even himself has always said in every interview that Bischoff has ever been in where he's talked about this, he said this was the moment. He said this is the moment where he got worried, where bringing in Mike Tyson to him was a big deal. Even though WCW was using celebrities, that same year they would bring in Rodman and Karl Malone in the middle of the fucking finals and have them face each other. To me, that was just as big of a deal, as Tyson, but, it worked better with WWE. Tyson coming into WWE, I think might have been better than Tyson going to WCW. They just used him better. And that confrontation with Stone Cold on Raw, that changed the game, man. And then they take us into WrestleMania 14 and Austin winning the title there, and how they talk more about how, the Attitude Era fit in with the current trends in society and showed a lot of clips from things that were going on back then. And, how Vince McMahon, just basically is like, we're just kind of going. He goes, we don't really set the trends. We follow the trends. And that's what they were doing at that time. They were doing whatever it took to make money. And if going in this salacious direction was good for business, that's what they were going to do. They delved into Mr. McMahon as a character with lots of clips of his crazy behavior. And that's when the producers, kind of asked Vince McMahon what similarities there are between himself and his character. And Vince says none. But then everybody else that they ask the same question to says that it's a combination of both, with a couple people saying they're the exact same guy. Hulk Hogan said it's the same dude. Vince McMahon and Mr. McMahon are the same guy, which was pretty funny. Bischoff, calls Vince out for ripping him off. And he's kind of right. I remember in those days when Vince McMahon turned heel, I remember thinking he's doing what Bischoff did. I did. I honestly thought that. And I remember thinking it was probably the right idea. Because Bischoff going heel, I thought he was also really good as a heel when he joined the NWO. But, he was, it was still kind of hard to wrap your head around. Vince doing it is a much bigger deal because Vince is the full-blown owner of WWE. This is a big jacked guy, and and Bischoff's own words, he did it better. But Bischoff did do it first and called Vince out for ripping him off. I thought that was funny. And then during this time, when WWE started to grow, WCW started to cool off. They got stale. They failed to make new stars. And WWE took over. I mean, they made Goldberg, but other than that, they were really just relying on what had been working for them, where WWE had lost what was working for them and rebuilt, to where they had a new cast of characters now that was fresh, that was new. Ooh, look what's going on over here. And now they are back in the driver's seat right around the same time that, The Rock starts to get on the map. And The Rock comes in and they chronicle his rise to stardom. And now WWE, their popularity is bigger than ever. And we're in an era where the content is questionable and controversial. So naturally, our friend Phil Mushnick is going to be super butthurt about this. And he was, due to the crude content. And there was a hilarious, oh my God, this was so funny. The hilarious moment where Vince is saying, he's trying to defend this era as being family entertainment when it's clearly marketed to the 18 to 34-year-old male, but it's also marketed for kids. The 18 to 34 is the core demo, but pro wrestling is still very attractive to children. And so you got a lot of the salacious stuff, the suckets, the beer, the middle fingers. And I don't know what it would have been like for me to be in school during this. A lot of you were in grade school or high school even during the Attitude Era. I was long since graduated by the time this came around. It would have been interesting for me as a fan being in 5th grade when this stuff was happening. My parents are pretty cool. They would have let me watch it. I don't think they would have really cared. I watched Beavis and Butthead and everything else that was controversial at the time. I had a TV in my room. I could do what I wanted. But I don't like, it would have been interesting at school. You know, I definitely would have probably been telling a teacher to suck it and everything. I'm just glad I'm the age that I was, because if this was going on when I was in, you know, 5th grade, 7th grade, something like that, it would have changed my whole perspective. But they talked about the controversial nature of the product, and Vince McMahon is trying to pass this off as family entertainment. And he says, this was such a wonderful edit. And he goes, we have no deaths, and then boom, a cut to a buried alive match. We have no guns, boom, cut to Pillman with the gun on Austin. We have no knives, boom, cut right to choppy your PP. And then Vince still claims it's family entertainment. It was so funny to him for him to say those things and them showing clips, just fact checking them, you know, right the moment he says it. Hilarious. What was not so hilarious is that we had to relive the death of Owen Hart, which of course is horrible. I will never be able to relive the circumstances of this death without getting a watermelon-sized lump in my throat. It's a wound that is not closed to this day. This past May, I did upload a podcast on the 25th anniversary of Owen Hart's death. Please check that out if you would like. It was a charity stream. And if you want to hear my thoughts on Owen and the circumstances surrounding his death, please go check out that video. But they talk about how Owen stuck around after the screw job. And, you know, in the past, Martha and Brett have said that Owen wanted to leave, but Vince wouldn't let him go, you know, but then we've heard stories where Owen wanted to stay. Don't really know what the truth is, to be honest, but Owen did stick around for a pay raise and a program with Shawn Michaels. Now, that never really panned out. Owen Hart never became champion. And Bret Hart feels that, you know, he was perhaps fucked with to get back at Bret. I don't believe that. Even Vince McMahon says, you know, it's a testament to Bret's ego if he thinks we would screw with Owen just to hurt him. And I don't really believe that either. You know, Owen, I was a big fan, but I understand maybe why he wasn't going to beat Shawn for the title. They were heading into WrestleMania 14. You know, Owen and Austin would have probably actually been a good match for the championship given their history, but having Tyson factored in, it worked much better with Shawn and DX. So I'm not going to really blame anyone there. But, you know, they talk about Over the Edge and how by the time we got to 1999, Owen was in the Blue Blazer gimmick. And I do believe that if the screw job never happened and Bret Hart stayed around and never left WWE, Owen Hart never would have been the Blue Blazer and he'd be alive today. So you can trace everything back to the screw job. I fully believe with 1,000,000,000% of my heart, if Bret Hart never got screwed, then Owen Hart is sitting here alive today as a 58-year-old man or whatever he would be. I firmly believe that, but you can't change history. So it's time for them to talk about Over the Edge. And they talk about his fall. And Vince brings up, you know, Owen fell during a blackout. Owen fell during the, or at least I think, because they show the clip of Jim Ross saying we have big problems out here. And Vince mentions that Owen fell when the lights were down when the promo was playing on the Tron. And Vince said if the lights would have been up and Owen fell, maybe he would have stopped the show. This was a lot about just the decision to stop the show. And it's really hard to watch that Jeff Jarrett promo where him and Deborah are beyond shocked and scared and in tears, you know, where they're praying for Owen. And then they have to go right into a promo about puppies. It is so gross to go back and watch. Here, your friend is dying before your eyes. And then you have to try to get back in character and talk about Deborah's tits. Are you kidding me? It's so hard to watch that. And it's so hard to support Vince's decision to not stop the show. You know, where Vince claimed, you know, Bret's like, if you drop Shane McMahon, they damn sure stop the show. And Vince is like, no, we wouldn't. I wouldn't stop the show if it was me. We'd keep it going. You know, so Vince is just different. They showed a lot of clips of Off the Record with Michael Landsberg, which was a great show back in the day, had a lot of wrestlers on it. And there was a clip there where he's interviewing Vince McMahon and he's talking about continuing the show and wrestlers wrestling in the ring right there where Owen's blood is. And I think it's really irresponsible of Netflix to put that on there because that's an untrue narrative. It's always been brought up that the blood stain on the mat was Owens. It was not. That was from the previous match. but it just sounds better. It sounds more salacious when you phrase it like the wrestlers were wrestling on top of Owen's blood. No, they weren't. And they should not have played that clip of Michael Landsberg. That was irresponsible and not right. Bret tells a story about how he had to be convinced. And this is why, Bret's my favorite wrestler of all time, and Vince McMahon is one of my least favorite human beings of all time. But in this situation, I agree with Vince that Bret has got a little bit of an ego. Because, Bret had to be convinced by a Kansas City police officer that Vince McMahon didn't kill Owen Hart to get back at him. Like, think of that. I know Vince McMahon is a madman. I understand that. But imagine the ego to believe that this company would kill your brother just because they're mad at you over a match. Like, that's crazy. And I never believed right from the very start that this was anything more than an accident. And so Bret said once he got that call from the police officer that said, hey, look, this was just an accident. This was not done on purpose at all. And Bret Hart had to be convinced that Vince McMahon didn't murder his brother, which I think is a little bit ridiculous. We then move on now to episode 5 entitled Family Business. And this is where we kind of backtrack a bit to Vince's childhood. Now, I had mentioned in the first episode that I was surprised that they didn't really talk much about his childhood. They glossed over it a bit, and we've actually heard more in WWE productions about Vince McMahon's childhood. So they kind of revisited it here and opened up with a couple of stories of Vince McMahon's physical and sexual abuse during childhood. And Vince admits that there was some incest in that trailer. And he implies that it was by his mother. Now, something this gross and this disturbing and this nuts has always been something that's been in our heads about Vince McMahon because he's a weird motherfucker. And so I've always felt that something went down in that trailer park in North Carolina when he was a kid that's probably difficult for him to talk about or think about. But we still don't really know the details of anything. And he admits here in the documentary, he says it in the interview, that there was incest. Now, his mother lived to be 101 years old. She died in 2022. She just died. Vince McMahon also has a brother that recently died. So there's nobody around who would be in the know here who can, granted you want to take, if somebody is claiming they were sexually or physically abused in any way, you want to take them at their word. But this is Vince McMahon we're talking about here. And I think this is a man that's willing to say anything, regardless if it's whether or not it's true or not. And Vince McMahon, they even showed a clip of Vince having his mother at Raw. So, if there was some incestual abuse there, I guess he's forgiven her, or I don't know. It's not my place to get inside somebody's head who deals with that. But they did kind of mention that. And then they transitioned into the upbringing of Stephanie and Shane McMahon. And this is really where you felt for Shane McMahon, because Shane really seems to have an interesting relationship with his dad. They talked about Shane starting at the bottom, being a referee, a ring attendant, a ring announcer, up until his debut in 1998, where he kind of gets over as the boy wonder. And Shane McMahon, even says, in this, that he was always under the assumption that he'd be the heir. This really seems to still bother him. And we never really knew, we speculated years ago when Shane McMahon left WWE, we knew it was a complicated situation. Definitely some issues there, maybe with the family. And prior to Stephanie and Triple H getting together, as a fan, I was also under the assumption that Stephanie and Shane would probably take over for their dad. But then Stephanie met Triple H. Triple H, got a backstage role in the company, started advancing, becoming Vince McMahon's right-hand man, becoming more of a son to Vince than Shane was. And you could almost tell all of this, even from an outsider's perspective looking in. And it sounds like that's actually kind of what went on here. And Shane McMahon, I think, was under the assumption that he was the prince and he would be the next king. And for whatever reason, they speculated that Stephanie, did it better than him or was better at this job than him. And of course, Vince McMahon not wanting to really give up power and having no interest in doing that. They talked about Stephanie getting involved as well. They talked about, how she came up, got on TV, and the wedding that Triple H interrupted that got them together on television. And It was basically all the McMahons. They showed a lot of footage of Stephanie getting over as a heel and how great she was back then and how she was pretty much willing to do anything just like her dad was. And Linda McMahon's appearances as well. They showed a lot of the angle with Trish Stratus. They got into the bark like a dog segment, which, has never made Vince McMahon look good. That nonsense that he made Trish do. And then, of course, the match with Shane McMahon at WrestleMania 17, where Linda stood up and kicked Vince in the nads and Shane wins and all of that. So they talked about the McMahon's involvement, the entire family being on television, being involved in storylines, and kind of touched on, a little bit of the relationship between Vince McMahon and Shane McMahon and how, it really appeared that he was really wanted his dad's approval. They talked about Sable, and this was wild, man. So they talked about Sable getting over, when she did, and then leaving the company and suing the company. But then she would return in 2003, and Vince McMahon in the documentary is asked if what does he remember about Sable and that lawsuit, and he didn't remember. And I remember even in 2003 thinking it was crazy that they brought her back in. And of course, she's on TV with Vince, and he's getting all up on her and making out with her. Vince is just such a disgusting maniac. He just putting himself in situations with these women on TV that allows him to grope them and stuff. It's just so disturbing to go back and watch. And they showed a lot of clips of him all up on Sable. But when the producers asked Vince what he remembers about the lawsuit from like 1999 when she left, and all of the horrible things that she alluded to, it was like $100 million lawsuit with some really fucked up allegations. Vince didn't remember. He didn't remember it even happened. Well, I remember it was kind of a blur. He goes, all I remember is she came back to work. Like, okay, I'm like, I don't know what changed in those 3 years there, but, Sable coming back was wild to me, even in 2003. I was at Judgment Day 2003. It was a bikini contest between her and Tori Wilson. Wild stuff. So they showed the gross affair storyline with Sable, and they talked about a 2001 Playboy article where he admits infidelity and whatnot, and they showed some disturbing quotes from that, where, he's cheated on Linda God knows how many times. Then they talk about the company going public right around the same time that WCW is starting to circle the drain. WWE then buys up WCW. And Brian Gewirtz and I think Bruce Pritchard as well both say that the plane ride on the Vince's jet that night was a wild one, and the drinks were flowing. Celebratory drinks were flowing that night that they purchased WCW, but it was business, right back to business the next day when it was over. They talked about the XFL, how great that started out, only to become a massive, colossal failure. They showed the Bob Costas interview. I watched that on HBO that night, and I could not believe what I was seeing with Vince McMahon getting in Bob Costas' face like that. I mean, at the time, I was kind of on Vince's side because I think Bob Costas was kind of cherry-picking moments, like the bark like a dog segment, which is terrible, but I felt like at the time anyway that Vince McMahon was bringing up a good point. Just stay tuned, asshole. You're about to see me get what's coming to me if you just watch the end of the story. There's a lot of people who do really disgusting things as a character on TV, and a lot of times they get their comeuppance. My situation will be no different. Just watch, and Vince was kind of right there, but that segment itself is just so disturbing and over the top and unnecessary. I think that's more of what the point was, but Vince was very defensive and came really close to punching Bob Costas in the face. They then talk about WWF becoming WWE. Now WWE loses the F. They lose the lawsuit to the Wildlife Fund. They talk about Hulk Hogan coming back to the company, mending fences with Vince McMahon, working with The Rock at WrestleMania. They talk about Bischoff coming in. But then right around that time is when, as a very loud military jet goes overhead here, they talk about Austin retiring, The Rock leaving to go make movies. I've got car horns and I've got fighter jets. Just a second. All right, I think we're all right. So they talk about Austin retiring. They talk about The Rock leaving to go make movies and how, business kind of goes down a little bit after that. And I remember that as a fan watching that, I felt like it wasn't like it used to be, And then they move into the ruthless aggression era and they debut, fighter jet. They move into the ruthless aggression era and the debut of John Cena and the rise of his rap character. And they show another montage of more over-the-top Vince McMahon shit. They show the Katie Vick stuff. The Trish Stratus, who's another name interviewed for this, she alludes to a time where she believed she was being punished for not wanting to make out with Mickie James, and then Mickie James wound up beating her at WrestleMania. She goes, I don't know for sure, but I can definitely say that people are punished if they don't do what's pitched to them sometimes. And then Vin, this is one of the most disturbing parts of the whole thing, is when the producers are asking, I think it's Stephanie, if there's ever been an angle that she's turned down. And we've all heard about the famous one that Vince McMahon pitched years ago where it was an incest angle, where he impregnated his daughter. And Stephanie doesn't even want to say it. She goes, I don't even want to say the one that I turned down. And then they immediately cut to Vince. He goes, I'll tell you. And Vince is like, the storyline is going to be like Stephanie's going to get pregnant. And I'm going to be the one that impregnated her. What the fuck is wrong with you? Especially in this very same episode, they're talking about the beginning of his childhood where he was sexually abused and there was incest in his life as a child. Now he wants to write an incest angle between himself and his daughter. This man is messed up, extremely messed up. And that's downright fucking offensive. And I'm glad that Stephanie was like, I don't think so. So they talked about that and how she turned that down. And then they kind of refocused on Shane McMahon and how Vince McMahon has been hard on his kids, but especially Shane McMahon. And Shane really seemed to have the same desire to be accepted that Vince did with Vince Sr. There was a lot of mirroring of that situation going on. Bonnie Hammer even alludes to the fact that she thought Shane was a black sheep sometimes based on how he was treated. She didn't really know what was going on. They talked about how Shane had wanted Vince to buy the UFC when they became available. UFC approached WWE about buying them. Shane wanted to buy the company and prove to his dad that he could run a company and be ready to take over WWE, but Vince didn't want to do it. Paul Heyman told a really crazy story about how Vince McMahon told Shane to stick a knife in his chest and kill him because that's the only way he's going to get his idea that he's pitching done. And Vince said, over my dead body. Just really, really hard on Shane McMahon. And ultimately, Shane McMahon chose to leave WWE in 2009. And the way Shane put it in the documentary is he was choosing to leave because he just wasn't seeing eye to eye with his father. There was a lot of stress and a lot of tension, and he was leaving in order to preserve that relationship. And that's wild to me. Vince doesn't seem like he would do the same for Shane. And Shane having a relationship and a good relationship with his father is so important to him that he was willing to walk away from the only thing he's ever wanted to do. So you really feel for Shane. And that's why I think he might go to AEW. I would love to see him go there. I really would. I'm the only one that would. So, Vince McMahon said that Shane wanted, the chair, but Vince didn't really want to give it to him. And basically reiterated that Shane left because he wanted to take over and Vince didn't want him to. And Vince seemed to be irritated that Shane wanted the business. And that's how they concluded episode 5, leaving us with the final episode entitled The Finish. And this was the end here of a lot of this story, but not before we got into some more ugliness. They start off by Vince McMahon mentioning that he has 3 different brains and it's hard to turn one off and one on. And sometimes he forgets which brain is supposed to be on at the right time. So just more craziness from Vince. They talk about the WrestleMania 23 match and everything surrounding that. We'll just skip that. And then we move into after the WrestleMania 23 match and Vince gets his head shaved. They move into Vince McMahon's midlife crisis and the limo explosion. And that's when that storyline was unable to be paid off because of a surprising tragedy that halted that storyline. And that, of course, is the Chris Benoit double murder suicide in 2007. I've talked about that. We've talked about that many times in the past as well. And Vince McMahon opened up Raw that night when he was supposed to be dead. It was supposed to be a memorial service for Vince McMahon. Instead, it's Vince standing in the ring in an empty arena announcing to the world that Chris Benoit, his wife, and his son were dead. And they ran a 3-hour tribute to Chris, only to find out that it was Benoit himself that did this. They talked a lot about the media coverage, blindly blaming roid rage. And that's when, and this is the first time, too, I've mentioned Vince McMahon utter Chris Benoit's name. because this is not a WWE production. WWE doesn't touch his name, but I haven't heard Vince McMahon say Benoit's name since like all of this happened. It was kind of crazy to hear him talk about this for the first time. And they talked about how the media was really focusing on the roid rage, but the real issue was probably, the CTE. And that's when Chris Nowinski, comes in. And of course, he got a concussion in his first year wrestling, forcing him into early retirement. And he dedicated his life to concussion research. And Nowinski suspected CTE right off the bat. And that's when he contacted Benoit's dad to see if he could get a piece of his brain to study. And it was concluded that Benoit absolutely did have CTE. And that's what's hard about the Benoit stuff, because you normally want to have sympathy. Think about how we would all be viewing Chris Benoit right now if he had just hung himself. Like if Nancy came home with Daniel from a trip at the grocery store and they come into their home to find Chris dead. He would have a lot of sympathy right now. We would all feel so bad about what happened to him and what can happen to the brain and what, because we've seen this with football players right here in my own city. Junior Seau, same thing happened. And we've seen a lot of this before already, and this is a problem. But I think because there's a double murder involved, that it's really hard to have sympathy for Chris, because I'm like, did he really have to kill his son and his wife? So that kind of takes away any sympathy. But imagine if it was just him. I think we'd be looking at the situation a lot differently, and I think WWE might not even shy away from talking about him. But because of the circumstances, it's the biggest, most horrible tragedy that wrestling has ever faced. And the craziest part about all of this, when they're talking about concussions, Stone Cold Steve Austin, you got to be fucking kidding me, is sitting there talking about concussions and whatnot. He goes, I wrestled, many, many years and I never got, a ton of concussions. And I think if you're getting a lot of concussions, then you're doing something wrong. And then he proceeds to say, I'm not a CTE guy. Just don't believe in it. Jesus, man, and it's like Stone Cold, CTE isn't something to be believed. It's not Santa. It's not something that you either believe in or you don't believe in. It is a medical proven fact. Chris Benoit had this. You don't believe in it or not believe in it. It doesn't matter if you believe or not believe in it. He has it. And the fact that he would say this shit on camera, I'm just not a CTE guy. I just don't believe in it. I don't believe in all the research and everything that's been done to really study this disease and all of the lives that have been lost because of this disease. Austin doesn't believe in it just because he was lucky enough not to get a bunch of concussions. That pile driver might have saved you, Austin. Had it not been for that pile driver, Austin really had to change his style after that. More ground-based brawling, not a lot of craziness. He wasn't really a high flyer to begin with, but he got a little gnarlier than he was. If he would have never had that neck injury, he might have wrestled a crazier style and might have gotten a few concussions, extra ones. I just cannot believe he said that. That was wild to me. And they talked about bringing in Chris Nowinski to educate on concussions, and the banning chair shots and, and things like that. And then WWE being under scrutiny for a lot of wrestlers dying young. Showed a footage of an interview where, Vince McMahon smacked the paper out of that guy's hands and whatnot, and just stupid, crazy behavior. They randomly fast forward all the way to The Undertaker losing his streak at WrestleMania 14. I think that's because he got a concussion in that match. And Vince McMahon on the documentary speculates that Taker wasn't concussed. He was just traumatized by losing because they talked about it being a last-minute decision, and Undertaker was shocked. And Vince McMahon kind of alludes to the fact that Taker was like either making it up or he wasn't concussed. He was just traumatized. I don't even know what that's about. They then talk about the move into the PG era and the rise of John Cena and the give divas a chance and the rise of Triple H backstage. And they talk about the return of Shane McMahon. In 2016, he comes back to the company, winds up having that match with The Undertaker. They showed him having his kids come out and do the entrance with him. And of course, the crazy bump that he took off the top of the cell. And then they showed clips of that King of the Ring match he had with Kurt Angle, where he was being thrown against that glass several times and landing on his head. And you think about all of those crazy bumps. I was at one of them, SummerSlam 2000, when Shane did the back bump off the staging with Steve Blackman. All of these crazy bumps that he took, it's like he's so desperate for his father's approval. You feel for Shane so much in this. and they showed the aftermatch of that Hell in the Cell match with Taker where he finally gets that hug from Vince McMahon. And, it seemed to be really, really important to him, to get that hug from his dad. And then it kind of cuts to all of the talking heads talking about how Vince McMahon is a father figure to them, and then they're kind of back to Shane, and his desire to take over the company. But now Stephanie is there and she's got a big role. Triple H's rose to power and there's really not a place for Shane McMahon. And of course, in modern times, he's gone from the company, and they now move on to their current era, over the last 10, 15 years with some moments of staleness, but now how they are as big as ever and they're doing great business right now. And that's when they asked Vince when he's going to retire. Vince, do you ever think you'll retire? And Vince says, I don't know, I'll never retire. I don't know why anybody would want to retire. He doesn't understand why anyone would want to do that. So anybody who wants to retire, just go die, as he says. And then they ask everyone else if Vince will ever retire, and nobody says that he will. And then Booker T with the best quote, Booker says, what would it take for Vince to retire? I'd say a nuclear bomb exploding. Boom. June 2022, jump cut. Wall Street Journal drops a report on a $3 million hush money payment that Vince had paid to an employee to keep her quiet after an alleged affair. And Vince then stepped down amid those allegations, and they talked once again about the anonymous email alluding to Vince conducting a consensual affair, but but she's still under the control of a boss. And as soon as that first story dropped, Vince McMahon canceled the rest of his interviews with Netflix. He just stopped after that story. And during that time, that's when they discovered the tanning salon story from 2006, where Vince was being accused of groping someone inappropriately. Then they uncovered a grand total of $12 million to 4 different women over the course of 16 years to suppress allegations of misconduct, including $7.5 million to a former wrestler, we all know who that is, who denied his advancements, and then they terminated her contract. So they talk about how Vince wound up staying on the board of directors during his time after he retired in July of 2022, but then forced his way back in January of 2023 by making moves in the board, removing a few board members in order to get the votes, despite the board unanimously voting to keep him out. He still winds up returning in January of 2023. During this time, Stephanie had taken over as CEO, co-CEO with Nick Khan, and Triple H was heading up creative. But then Vince McMahon pushed his way back in 2023 as executive chairman in order to try to sell the company, which they, of course, wound up doing. They sold to Endeavor. They merged with the UFC to form the TKO group. Vince now has executive chair, but this time it's different because he's not in control of everything. He doesn't have full control. And then they talked about how they signed the deal with Netflix this past January on the 40th anniversary of Hulkamania, signed the big, huge, multi-billion-dollar deal with Netflix. And this was the funniest part. Bruce Pritchard is asked if he's seen any of this is a fast forward now to January 2024. Bruce is back. They asked him if he's seen any of the documentary so far, any of the episodes. And he goes, yeah. He goes, I think it sucked. He goes, it felt like a gotcha piece. And Vince is and Bruce, who of course is all the way up the ass of Vince McMahon, is, saying that they don't know the real Vince. And he talked about how Vince, helped his wife when she had cancer. And that's all very nice. But that doesn't mean that Vince isn't a dirtbag. You can't just point to say, hey, look at this nice thing he did. Even Hitler gave people presents. I'm pretty sure P. Diddy did nice things for people. I know O.J. Simpson kissed a baby or two. Doesn't mean they're not pieces of shit. So this is somebody that's very, very close to Vince McMahon that just doesn't like the way he's being portrayed. So he says that he thinks it sucks and it was a gotcha piece. And then literally 2 days later, the Janelle Grant lawsuit was filed. 1 day after that, Vince McMahon resigns. So they had The woman who broke the Wall Street Journal story, she was on this as well, and she's talked about how she's written many pieces on sexual misconduct suits in the past. And they showed the clips of the text messages, which if you just read those alone, I don't know how anybody can really defend Vince McMahon after everything we know about him. And the type of things that are said in these text messages are extremely disturbing. Extremely disturbing. And they talked about the defecation. They talked about the sex toys. They talked about implementing Brock Lesnar. This is the first time they said him by name, Brock Lesnar. Being implemented here is Vince McMahon was going to traffic Janelle Grant to Brock Lesnar to perform sexual acts for him in exchange for re-signing his contract. She was part of the deal. Having sex with her was part of his contract. That's messed up. And then, of course, one day after the lawsuit, Vince McMahon is officially pushed out. They said, enough, you're done. They also brought up the Ashley Mazzaro stuff and the rape that she claimed happened to her in Kuwait that WWE tried to cover up to protect the relationship with the military. And they talk about how Mazzaro was also, Vince made advancements towards her and she denied those advancements. And then after that, they started putting her in terrible storylines and situations. And they showed one severely disturbing clip of Vince McMahon being an absolute monster to her, getting right in her face. And you can just see it. Even though he's playing a character on TV, you can see how much he gets off on just being up on people, being dominant over women, being in their face, and being able just to control like that. It's so gross. It makes you want to fucking throw up, and Ashley, the way she was crying during all of that, it was just so hard to watch. And that was pretty much what they closed with there. They wanted that lasting image of Vince McMahon to be a bad one. And it was. It really was. That was tough to see. But now Vince is gone. They focused on how WWE's been thriving in his absence. And they closed with a montage of all of the wrestlers and talking heads talking about what they believe Vince's legacy will be. And they said a wide range of a lot of things. But you have to keep in mind that was all before the scandal. So this whole entire documentary, I think, did a really good job of telling the story of Vince McMahon's life, telling the story of WWE, even though a lot of it didn't give us new information. A lot of us fans who know all of this stuff already didn't really get any earth-shattering news or whatnot. But I'm not really judging it by that. I'm judging it by the overall, enjoyment factor, I guess, of the documentary and how it portrayed the story, and I thought it did fine. If you're somebody who doesn't watch a lot of wrestling or doesn't know much about wrestling, and you're curious about Vince McMahon and his legacy, this does a pretty good job of telling you who this man was. And now that it's over, the only thing that's left is to see what the future holds for Vince McMahon in terms of, his legal troubles, this lawsuit, and of course the search warrant and whatever repercussions he's going to face for his horrible behavior. There might be a whole nother documentary coming out. But in terms of WWE or Vince McMahon's life in connection to WWE, that story is pretty much told. The only chapter that's left is what happens to Vince in his personal life. And I thought this documentary was good, but maybe I was hoping for it to be slightly juicier than it was. From the reviews I've seen online, it's been a disappointment, but I still thought there was a fair amount to talk about here. And that's pretty much the end of this documentary. And I'm sorry that I can only hang out for another couple of minutes before I got to bail, because we really cut it close. I only had a 2-hour allotted time here to do this, and I am about 2 minutes away from needing to wrap this up. But I do want to cruise to the chat, knock out a couple supers that I saw in my peripherals come through. I want to thank Jay Boba for the $5. Bruce Pritchard will defend Vince till the end, even when he ends up being guilty in jail. Unbelievable. Yeah, he will. He absolutely will. And that's a whole nother story. Maybe we'll talk more about Bruce and stuff tomorrow on the podcast. But I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. Michael Kumo, thank you for the $5 as well. I was 10 to 14 years old during the Attitude Era. Even my born-again Christian stepmother was fine with me watching WWF. She became a fan of Test. That's awesome. Test was great. Rest in peace, Andrew Martin. I liked him too. But anyway, I appreciate you guys being here. I'm sorry I don't have a lot of time just to cruise through the chat and talk a lot, but I got to get out of here. It's Friday night. I'm going to work. But we will be back tomorrow for probably a shorter Winged Eagle. because I'm going to have kind of a smaller one and less time to work with tomorrow. But later on tonight, I'll post a link for tomorrow's podcast. So please join us for that. And thank you so much for joining us today. If you don't mind, please hit that thumbs up button on your way out the door. And if you're not a subscriber and you like what you saw and heard today, I would appreciate you sticking around and giving me that subscription. I will talk to y'all tomorrow night or tomorrow afternoon. In the meantime, have a great Friday night and enjoy your upcoming weekend. Peace.